This webinar, brought to you by University of Houston Continuing Education, originally aired on February 9th, 2010. This is Performance Management. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. For more information, visit uh.edu/empower.
Is just the tip of the iceberg. And oftentimes, when we allow performance issues to go unaddressed, when we finally begin to address them, we're only dealing with that which is kind of sticking out of the surface of our awareness. But what happens is, if you take off that top issue, then one more thing floats up behind it. And what we come to find ourselves dealing with is this huge problem that we never really were salient of. We didn't realize it existed. But performance issues are a reality of management, and human nature is to test boundaries. And many employees appreciate knowing where they are. And that's what effective performance management really is: setting boundaries and enforcing them. Yet oftentimes we do not let our people know they've crossed the boundary until they're headed out the door. It would be like telling a football player, you've crossed the foul line, when they're in the parking lot. It just, at the point that we decide to address the performance, it can almost become irrelevant. So, in order to address a performance, first of all, we have to talk about whose fault is it. I grew up on a rice farm that was owned by my grandfather and father. And this was one of my grandfather's favorite adages about any time I would complain about something on the farm. It's a bad horse doesn't say much for the person who bought it, and even less about the person who keeps using it. Now, I understand the proclivity to compare our employee groups to horses. I'm certainly not doing that. But what I'm trying to say is, the moment you as a manager notice a performance issue, it is now your responsibility. At that point, when you notice or become aware of a performance issue, you are now as responsible for it as the person who is having the performance issue. When we let poor performance go by unaddressed, we have begun contributing to the problem. So when we think about it in that light, when we think, okay, by not mentioning this, I'm also contributing to the problem, we really do come to understand that an underperforming employee is just as much the problem of the manager and the organization they're in as it is the individual. In fact, I would argue that management style is the primary contributor to chronic and system-affecting underperformance in employees. Now, I'm willing to argue the academics of that a little bit, but really, it's the function of an organization in many cases, and I think we've lost this a little bit, and I'm straying into my area of opinion here, but it's not only our role as managers to address underperformance and restore people to performance, but also to identify times when they may not be able or willing to return to acceptable performance, and to help them see the options that they have in front of them. And either it's like the old adage in HR: either manage them up or manage them out. And so when we don't do that, we become a contributor to this poor performance. And as we see in my lovely graphics, we oftentimes do not deal with performance until the employee has made a complete departure from organizational objectives. Once we reach this point, the effort needed to correct the issue and get the employee back to acceptable performance is exponentially higher than if we would have corrected initially. So what we see is, and I think this is true, it's been true for me in my management style, when we wait until objectives are compromised before we address employee performance, what we are doing is making it so difficult for us to raise that employee back up to a level of acceptable performance that sometimes we just give up. Oftentimes, we don't even bring them back to acceptable performance. So now we've talked about the reasons why. Now we're going to talk about some solutions. Earlier, I listed a few reasons I think performance goes unaddressed early on. The first reason performance goes unaddressed early on is because we do not notice it. As a manager, you need to have your ear to the ground, as they say, when it comes to your team. And the best way to do this is to find the gaps in your expectations of your team's performance and your own performance. That is to say, Are you expecting everything of yourself that you are expecting of your team? I know that do as I say, not as I do works, but it requires a lot much more effort. And this is the part we all hate to hear. I won't say that you can't expect from others what you aren't willing to do yourself, but I will say that it requires a lot more energy to do it. Now, I'm not saying that if you can't expect an employee to complete a report that's in their job area if you're not willing to do it. I wouldn't go that far, but if you expect your people to be professional and on time and dressed appropriately, general overarching things like that, you've really got to be willing to set that example yourself, or else you're going to have to be willing to put a lot more effort in keeping their performance up if you're not setting the example. Setting the example allows you to gain a level of personal authority. How you set the example is up to you. It could be as simple as working to make sure your email communications are free of grammatical errors, or arriving to work at the appointed time. Second, we have a perception that the reason we let performance go unchecked is because we often feel that dealing with a performance issue opens us up to potential risk of getting involved in some nasty emotional conflict with the employee. And a lot of times we just say, it's just easier to let it go. It's just a small issue. We're just going to walk past it. I would assert to you that effective managers reject this idea. We need to get better acquainted with all the tools available to us as managers. I mean, you really wouldn't air up a tire with a wrench, and not every performance issue needs to be handled with some document that has scary words like reprimand or formal conversation. There is a time and place for that. And I believe if you start dealing with performance early on, you will see the amount of document-driven discipline drop. So when we deal with performance early, we deal with it early on, we see those, we can get away, hopefully, from only waiting to attack it when we feel like it's this documentable thing. So how do we deal with this? Well, I'm going to talk about a tool that I learned in our Coaching Tools for Leaders certificate program. And in fact, the instructor who teaches that, the faculty member, Madison, is here in the room today. And that's acknowledgement. And I really think acknowledgement is the right tool for addressing a performance issue, that small issue, early on in a way that allows us to deal with it quickly and then move on. So we deal with the performance issue immediately, and using this tool of acknowledgement, we can keep from making a molehill into a mountain. I think it's kind of the medical equivalent of an outpatient procedure. It's quick, relatively painless, and won't derail the work process. So how does it work? Well, it's a simple in explanation, but I would say it's difficult in application. But with practice, you can become a skillful user of acknowledgement. I'm going to spend some time on this because I think it's an extremely effective tool. So let's look at what makes a good acknowledgement. First, a good acknowledgement is very specific, and I'm going to get into that into a little bit more detail in a minute. Second, it's action-based. You're speaking about what was done or what has happened. Third, it does not include any statements about you, I, me, etc. And fourth, and this is really the hardest one with me, it's said without any judgment. In fact, Madison would tell you it's said with a lot of curiosity. For the sake of this webinar, we're going to narrow that down a little bit and say that it really is said without any judgment, meaning that there's no intonation in your voice that indicates any type of preconceived decision that you've made about this person and the issue that you're addressing. I, in using this tool, have often found myself having to stop and evaluate my statements before making them.